Hi, I'm Paul Baxter now, and here we are at part 3, the third and final part in my first series on my bodybuilding career and anabolic steroids, the dark side of our sport. Now, we've covered my natural years and my first experiences of anabolics, and at the end of part 2 we had just begun discussing growth hormone. So let's begin there. Growth hormone. It has that magic sounding name, doesn't it? Like it should produce something remarkable. Well, let's see if it did and does. I think it was around 1995 that I first used growth hormone. I used it pre-contest in the way that I described in part 2. And the results were far from the extraordinary claims that I had heard about. I leaned out maybe a little quicker and held on to perhaps a little bit more muscle mass, but not the enormous results that I had heard about or perhaps was expecting. In the end, the myths of growth hormone are pretty much that, unless that is, you're prepared to use much larger amounts. The amounts I was using was negligible and simply not high enough to present great results. So I had gathered great information during that cycle that for the cost to benefit ratio, growth hormone is just not worth it, unless that is, you have access to pharmaceutical grade growth hormone at a cheap price. And those two don't go together. You can't get cheap pharmaceutical grade growth hormone unless it's been stolen or you're being sponsored to take it. However, after discussing my experience with my 2 most trusted advisors, they pretty much said the same thing, that unless I was to increase the dose, then it just wasn't worth using. And at my level, the cost couldn't be justified. However, one of them did say something interesting, and he had a theory that he wanted me to try and see if I could get better results using it in a different way. He suggested that I continue to use it in a post-contest environment and in a high androgenic environment. So I thought about the idea and I decided, yes, I was going to give it a try since I was intrigued by what the results may be. Again, we were our own experiments back then. And people may have given us information and advice and thoughts, but ultimately, I was the one who decided what I was prepared to try. And so for the next 40 days, I continued to take the growth at 4 IUs in the morning, but in a high androgenic environment. Remember, as you approach a show, your use of testosterone decreases to short-acting propionate to avoid any water retention. And he felt that the higher androgenic environment would allow the growth to respond better. So I upped the testosterone to 1,000 milligram per week. I think I used Sustanon, 4 ampules per week, together with 600 milligrams of equipoise and the 4 IUs of growth hormone in the morning each day. The results were very different. Because I was coming straight out of a show, my body was like a sponge. I'd been dieting and restricting my food intake for weeks. My body was then catabolic, and suddenly putting it into a high anabolic and high androgenic environment with 4 heavy training days per week with 3 days of complete rest, my body simply exploded. It was like creating the perfect environment for growth. My body utilized the growth hormone much better, and I put on 1 pound a day for the first 30 days, with my body fat remaining very close to that on show day, just with a lot of added water within the muscle and also subcutaneous. I looked freaking huge. I remember people in the gym saying, You should have gone on stage like this. You're shredded and massive. You're a freak. But what they didn't realize is those stage lights are unforgiving in terms of water weight. And if I had competed like that, I probably would have looked like a water balloon. My striations, those crisp, detailed feathers on my muscles, probably would have been blurred. And despite the extra muscle, glycogen and water, I wouldn't have looked as good. But in terms of generating growth after a show, it worked perfectly. That was the last time I used growth hormone. I decided I loved how it worked after the show, but I had by then decided not to pursue my pro card and to focus on my family and business instead. I knew I was a good bodybuilder, but I also knew that I wasn't a genetic freak like a Dorian, like a Charles Claremont, like an Ian Harrison. So I tucked it away as knowledge for the future if I ever coached, which I did end up doing for about 20 years. Now, I will give you my observation of those athletes who have used growth hormone for extended lengths of time, and also who have used dosages greater than the 4 to 8 IUs a day that people like Dorian were using back in the 90s. Yes, it definitely does have an anabolic effect, used in larger dosages, but with the anabolic effects also comes an increase in the size of your internal organs and of your abdominals, just like any other body part. Now, I don't know where that line is between keeping your physique nice and aesthetic and when your internal organs and stomach begins to overdevelop, but I would guesstimate it's around the 15 IU a day mark. So when I hear of ridiculous amounts of like 20 to 24 IUs a day, I shake my head, not just in sadness, but in terror about what they are doing to themselves in the long term. A telltale sign is of abs that have become separated from each other with large gaps in between them. Now, this split abs looks terrible and very much takes away from the aesthetic of the entire physique. Not only does large dosages and extended use cause this problem in the abdominals, but I do believe that it also causes the skin to thicken. Hence, one of the reasons why current athletes just cannot get the conditioning of the athletes of the 90s. They can get their body fat just as low and they can get almost as dry, but the look of paper thin skin and shredded fibers across all body parts is no longer seen. And for that, I put the blame partly on the use of growth hormone and the protocol of its use today. Now, insulin. Well, I'm a type 1 diabetic, so insulin is now something that I've always had to accept was part of the process of balancing blood sugar with carbohydrates and insulin. The way I take insulin was based upon the conversation that I had with Sir Steve Redgrave's diabetic consultant. Sir Steve Redgrave became a type 1 diabetic after overstressing his body in the off-season one year, and his immune system literally turned in on itself and shut down his pancreas. Well, my diabetes was caused in exactly the same way, except it wasn't from training too hard. It was as a result of the accident that I had in 2007 when a set of stairs collapsed underneath me, breaking my pelvis, my quadriceps, my knee and my spine. I had never taken insulin as part of bodybuilding, and it was only around 1996 to 97 that I even heard about it mentioned as being used for bodybuilding. It was just too risky in my head to take something like insulin, which can kill you pretty quickly as compared to anabolics, which never have been directly linked to anyone's death. In fact, the only drugs that can cause death in the short term in bodybuilding are insulin and diuretics. Insulin I never touched, and diuretics I only ever used twice. Once disastrously, and then the second time when I was getting ready for the World Championships and I wanted to pull out all the stops. And so I asked Dorian about using them. His advice was based around what he had done for the 93 Olympia. And that was literally to take just one aldactone tablet on the Thursday, and for me, another one on the Friday, but to only take the Friday one if I felt like I really, really needed it. I always came in very dry anyway, so I think it was partly the way we trained, which was high intensity, heavy squeezing of the muscle throughout the year, and then dieting to extremely low levels of body fat. Any more diuretics he felt would do nothing but flatten me out, and at over 6 foot tall, I couldn't afford to look flat. I had to keep as much fullness as possible. Otherwise, I would look stringy and lack the muscle of the other competitors. I did have a previous experience with diuretics, which resulted in me having a very negative view of them and their use. I do believe you can achieve dry, grainy condition without diuretics. Dorian proved that in the year that they were tested for and banned, and he still came in desert dry. It happened at the beginning of my competitive career with anabolics, and it was at the British finals. Now, I'd prepped hard and I was shredded and dry, or so I thought. But an early advisor, and I'm not going to mention any names as it wouldn't be fair to them or their memory, said to me that, yes, you're ready, Paul, but you could be a little bit drier. And lo and behold, he had the very thing which he suggested would bring out that extra dryness he thought I needed. Again, it's wrong to blame anyone, whoever it was, because it was my responsibility to look after my own prep and my own health. But it was at a time when I wasn't as confident in my own reasoning and logic as I became later, and so I agreed to do it. It involved taking a diuretic, Lasix, IV, that's right, IV, something that I'd never done before, or never had done to me before. I'd never been in a hospital before, so I had never had anybody stick a needle in one of my veins. But I said, let's go for it. And he injected me with an unknown amount of Lasix. I have no idea how much he used, and in truth, I didn't really care back then. As long as it did the job, I thought, nah, do it. Well, this was the night before the show, and so I woke up on show day actually feeling good. Well, as good as you can when you're around 3% body fat and dehydrated. I pumped up backstage and noticed I had definitely flattened out a little. And I was a fraction drier, but nothing shockingly different. However, I was already dry, so how much difference could I have expected it to make? I got on stage, still feeling good, and except for a little cramping in one of my calves, I had no problems at all. I was pleased with the result, took my trophy back to where I was staying, my girlfriend's mother's house, which was close to where the British finals were in Southport. I had some ice cream, I had some diet soda, and feeling very tired, I went to bed. I woke up to find my girlfriend looking over me, panic-stricken and looking relieved. I tried to raise my head and found that it felt very heavy and my body was extremely tired and achy. She said to me that I just slept for over 24 hours straight and that she had woken me up at intervals to get me to drink an electrolyte drink, as she knew I must be dehydrated. And with an almost frighteningly look into the future, only a couple of years later, when Momo Benaziza died through diuretics, I realized that I had had a very lucky escape. And although later that day I did feel fine again, and I even trained the day after that, in hindsight, it was a very close call. That was the moment I decided I was never going to allow anyone again to make a decision for me with regards to my health or my bodybuilding. As we now know, with tragic examples to name, both insulin and diuretics can kill quickly, and hence must be avoided completely, or if you take the decision yourself to tamper with these two dangerous classes of drugs, then do so with great care and accept the responsibility is yours, and to never allow a coach or a guru to advise you on either of those two items. Obviously, I've seen the massive changes in bodybuilding over the years. When I returned to competition in 2004 after my first retirement, I'd noticed an increased use of anabolics and insulin, and also the use of oil injected into body parts. This was not a part of bodybuilding for me, but I could see it in others, and sadly the judges weren't apparently able to see it. Now its use is endemic, and it's rare to see a physique that doesn't have oil inside its delts and biceps and triceps. I've even seen it in people's chests, back, traps and legs. Back when I first competed, there was a product called Esicline, which would be used before a contest as it inflamed an area, creating a swelling inside the muscle, sometimes adding size to an area, often a weak area. It was used mainly in calves and delts, as it often gave the big bowling ball look to a physique. And yes, many of the great physiques of the late 90s that we look back on as the golden classic era do actually have Esicline inside of them, especially their delts. But again, it was only certain bodybuilders who used it, and you could always tell who they were, as there was a definite lack of definition that came with any benefit of using it. I did try it in one calf one year, 96 I think it was, but the pain in the site was like a bee sting, and I literally couldn't walk on that leg for a day. So after that trial episode, I decided no way was I ever going to try it ever again. The thing that worries me with the oil today being used is, where does it go? The body has to expel it somewhere, somehow, and it has to go through the kidney or the liver to do that. Add to that the danger of it entering the bloodstream, as happened to a very famous pro who nearly died due to it going towards his heart, then I think it's taking bodybuilding in a terrible direction. Firstly, it's not building muscle. It's fake muscle filled with oil. Secondly, the body parts smooth out and lack definition. Why is it that all the tiny details in the arms seen in the 80s and the early 90s and 2000s, they can't be seen today? Why has conditioning been criticized as being worse today than in previous eras? It has, and it is, because of the use of oil. Excessive growth hormone, which thickens the skin, encourages growth in all muscle, not just the ones you want to proudly display on the outside of your physique, but the inner organs too. Thicker skin means less definition. Oil means blurring of details and worse condition. The separation between the biceps and the brachialis and the triceps should be three separate distinguishable groups. Today, they are like one big glob of muscle. That isn't how the human body looks without oil in it. Large amounts of growth hormone also cause the abdominals to split due to the increased size of the inner organs. So check out the abdominals of the top guys today and see how many of them have abs with large gaps between them and a distension of the stomach. Is this what causes the distension of stomach we see today? Well, not exactly just that, but also the large quantities of food ingested in the hours before getting on stage in an attempt to carb up quickly, often with insulin. That causes large quantities of food to remain in the stomach, partly undigested, and can show as distension. But I believe the main reason may be insulin growth, IGF-1, and the huge amounts of food creating the perfect storm for stomach distension. So where is the industry at today? Well, I can only talk about my experiences with people I know, old clients and people at the gym who currently use anabolics. And the dosages are literally crazy. That is, if the products they are using are 100% genuine in terms of the quantity of the active ingredient in them, which I have to doubt. And the other major difference between today and when I started out is the speed at which people are deciding to go on anabolics. It's as if they think training just goes with anabolics. They are often using them within months of beginning the sport, which is ludicrous, as they are giving themselves no time whatsoever in which to build a natural base. In other words, all their built muscle has effectively been built on drugs, and when they come off the drugs, which they often never do until they stop training, all the gains they have made disappear very quickly. The competitive scene is also just plain crazy just now with first timers. I know, using every anabolic they can think of or their coaches can think of in order to get on stage for the first time, including growth hormone. So much for the, if you can't get a pro card without growth, then you're just not good enough. And that's with the federations literally handing out pro cards for turning up. The problem is the sport has become entirely about money for the coaches and the federations, and no thought is given to the sport itself, and hence its decline, not just in standards but in popularity from the general public. Remember, in the 1980s there was a fashion, a trend for going to the gym, and bodybuilders were seen regularly on television, ESPN, getting roles in movies and TV. But now they are seen more frequently as freaks, drugged up freaks as that. And I digress. I know it's not going to be a popular stance to take, but bodybuilding has to return to the love of training first, to have an inner circle of true bodybuilders that only allow someone into the club once they have served their apprenticeship. Now, with the advent of online coaches, who are sometimes no more than glorified drug dealers, sometimes, not always, but these coaches have frequently no real experience in the sport. I know several online coaches that are prepping clients for shows when they have only done one show themselves, and have their own online coaches themselves. I mean, how crazy is all of that? I never had a coach. Neither did Dorian. Neither did Lee Haney, Sergio Olive, Arnold. And yet they managed to do it. No one in my day had a coach. It was unheard of. And now everyone, it seems, has to have one in order to compete. And if they do compete without one, they declare it like they deserve an extra prize for having the brains to work it out for themselves. No, it's all wrong. Your learning and advice will come when you serve your apprenticeship. Once you show signs of having a physique worthy of showing on stage, people will come to you and offer help. Trust me. Crimes often return to their teacher, as Seneca said. These coaches will have a lot on their conscience eventually. Some already will have, with the number of deaths the sport is seeing. Now, I'm not disputing individual responsibility in this. In fact, individual responsibility is even more important today, so that you take every single responsibility for every single action you take. So in summary, let me close by outlining a few highlights of my own experiences and why you might be persuaded to follow the guideline outlined in this episode. Push as far as you can naturally before you begin to use chemical aids to muscular enhancement. When or if you decide to use anabolic agents to push your physique beyond that attained naturally, you should begin with the lowest dosages possible that will still take you further beyond those limits. Begin by using just 1 or 2 agents to begin with, and make those agents proven and relatively safe pharmaceuticals, such as testosterone and a highly anabolic agent. Keep the dosages at the minimal levels that have been shown to produce results. As your body increases its muscular development, the higher the dosage may be required, and the variety of compounds may also be needed to learn which compounds work best for your own personal endocrine system. Don't use highly advanced agents until you really need to utilize them. In other words, if you start using growth hormone, insulin, high levels of various compounds, thyroid, medications and stimulants too early, what is left to you when you really need to up your game and make a big leap forward? If you start low and with few compounds, then you've always got something else to add into the mix to keep you growing. Insulin and diuretics are the 2 most dangerous compounds in the entire bodybuilding arsenal of drugs. Do not touch these compounds without expert and medical advice. Growth hormone is not the magic potion that the name suggests. At lower dosages, 2 to 4 IUs per day, it can assist in building muscle and increasing fat loss if the calorific and hormonal environmental factors are aligned. Accept that every drug has the potential for side effects and damage to the human body. Scientific evidence suggests that anabolic steroids are unlikely to cause damage as long as they are not abused in the length of the cycle and the levels of dosage. Stay away from injecting any type of site enhancement oil, no matter how clean it is or how well manufactured it is. It is fake bodybuilding and detracts from your physique. Yes, I'm aware that most of the entire Olympia lineup, most pro lineups, have nearly all got oil in their arms, delts and other areas. But do you see the split heads of the biceps like you did on the 80s and 90s bodybuilders? No. Do you even see the differently shaped biceps and triceps of unique physiological human bodies? Rarely, because they are mostly full of oil. Whether to enhance the size or to try and change the shape of the biceps and the triceps, it's crazy. Don't do it. And where do you think the oil goes? Hit a vein and you're almost dead, like Milosh experienced. And I'm absolutely sure he wouldn't mind me saying that. as he is one of the very few bodybuilders who is telling it like it is today. Milos is a great guy, and we message regularly. In fact, Milos is one of the few coaches who is now producing physiques very similar to the 90s bodybuilders by making them work harder and dialing them in correctly. When you get it right, anabolic steroids have their place in competitive bodybuilding at a certain level and driving past your natural genetic limitations. And used correctly can actually improve your health indicators at certain ages and levels, but it has downsides that need to be considered. Not having regular off periods can damage your own ability to produce testosterone. It can cause increased hemoglobin levels, causing thicker blood, and something that needs regular checks by your doctor. But, and I would be remiss if I didn't say this, do not ever feel pressurized or peer pressurized into taking any drug, whether recreational or bodybuilding. Long-term studies on anabolic steroids are very few and far between, and the scientific literature just is not there to comprehensively say one way or the other what the specific dangers are with using them. Yes, we do know that they increase your hemoglobin levels. They can affect negatively your coronary output once a dosage increases above what your individual body can cope with. What that level is unique in everyone, and therefore, if anyone tells you that they are safe, then they're ill-informed. But likewise, if they tell you that they are dangerous, again, they are ill-informed. Just like every other drug, they have benefits and possible side effects. The question you have to ask yourself is, for what reason am I taking this drug? Is it for insecurity, for improving confidence, for leveling out a competitive playing field, to look good, to help you feel better as you reach your 50s? Only you and your physician can make that informed decision. And yes, I would advise, if you do begin any anabolic use, to inform your GP. That way they can monitor your blood markers and check liver and kidney levels regularly and hopefully avoid any damage at all. I would always tell someone that it is better to never start using them than to have to come off them in the first place. Stay natural unless you really think that you can make something of yourself in this sport. If not, you jeopardize not just your physical health, but your mental health as well. Just ask Eddie Abu, who is a trained mental health nurse and ex-competitive pro bodybuilder. I am sure he would give you similar advice to what I'm saying today. It's a difficult topic. I was never going to scout around it, as I've always said I will tell you the truth, but I also have a responsibility to you to make you aware of the potential pitfalls of using them, should you decide to do so. At the end of the day, there are many golden era bodybuilders still in great health and looking superb in their 60s, 70s and 80s. And yet, we are now recently seeing a sad increase in deaths of younger bodybuilders, which without full autopsy reports, we can only ever speculate at why this is happening. All I would say, and I'm not going to speculate on why this is happening, yes, I do have my own theories, but without evidence, they are simply uninformed opinion. But the types of compounds and the dosages of these newer compounds and the increased dosages of the traditional compounds suggest something has changed with regards to the way these drugs are used and perhaps other recent medical interventions not previously used before in everyday life may also have a deadly impact due to its use alongside anabolic steroids, due to an already elevated hemoglobin red blood cell count. And if we do not have full disclosure on these deaths, then it will become difficult, if not impossible, to be sure on how to avoid them in the future. There were days in the 70s when some gyms had huge signs above the counters saying, "Up your dosage," in a fun, hardcore way. Sadly, those days of innocence are long gone, and we can no longer take them without having a good knowledge about how they work and how to use them properly should you decide to do so. I hope this has helped in some way give you the history of my own use of these compounds, and also given you the confidence to hold off on taking them for as long as possible, to fully tap out your own genetic potential before even considering them. Drug use in bodybuilding has been there since the 60s, if not before. It became common in the 70s, prevalent in the 80s, even more in the 90s with newer experimental compounds, and since then every decade has had new compounds developed and found and experimented to see if they can help a human body add muscle tissue and or lose body fat. Some of the most recent are research chemicals, never ever passed for human use, and may have highly cancerous tendencies, yet they are producing great gains in muscle mass. Has it also improved the physiques or condition of the athletes though? No. Has it made the athletes lazier? Well, perhaps some, but there are still plenty of hard-working athletes busting their balls off to make true solid gains and bring those gains to the stage in rock hard, freaky dry condition. Is there a risk with this? Absolutely. But that is where it comes down to individual choice and individual responsibility. I wish you all well. I wish that you take my advice and never start on the road to anabolics. But if you wish to compete at a decent level, that then you take my advice into consideration and begin slowly and gradually with your compounds. Imagine if you enter a first-timers show and you've used everything available. Anabolics, testosterone, growth hormone, diuretics even. Where have you got to go to from there? How can you up your game from there? You've already used all the cards on the table. So what can you do? Up the amounts? Well, you see, there's the craziness coming into play. Use the minimal amounts you need for your level. And like we used to say, and I believe it is still true to this day, if you can't win your pro card without using growth hormone, then you don't have the genetic gifts to be a top 5 bodybuilder anyway. And perhaps you need to look at another sport or train and compete just for fun and leave the expensive and the dangerous compounds alone. As Metallica would say, it's sad but true, my friends. Yes, there is much more to cover on this subject, and I will return to it later at some point. But I felt it was important to not avoid the elephant in the room where most people, top bodybuilders themselves, avoid. Look, they have contracts with supplement companies. Do you think they want their athletes telling people what they took in performance-enhancing drugs and then still try and sell you their latest protein powder or pre-workout drink? Of course not. But someone needs to give some realistic advice on what not to do. And if you do decide to do it, a responsible message in how you should begin. Do your own research. Don't ask your local gym drug seller. Of course, they will want to try and sell you as much as possible. I've seen recently first timers taking growth hormone. Growth hormone, for goodness sake. Seriously, they need to take some individual responsibility, do their own research, and not get caught up in the hype that surrounds this industry today. This message comes at a time of great loss in the industry, and therefore I don't think it could come at a better time for people to hear it. Oh, and yes, finally, I think all that's left for me to say is some thoughts of the magnitude of life and the decisions that you personally make. Think about this. Watch the stars in their courses and imagine yourself running alongside them. Think constantly on the change of the elements into each other, for such thoughts wash away the dust of earthly life. Wash away the dust of life, the hype, the glamourese, as the Scots would say, the hype and the lure of instant gratification. Think long term, but act in the moment with every ounce of honesty, integrity, and truth that you can muster. And do the right thing. Your gut will tell you what that is. You don't need me or anyone else to tell you that. So till next week, friends, back then to some more bodybuilding stories from the 80s and the 90s. Thank you for watching these episodes. I hope you've enjoyed. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so yet. I don't receive anything from either these blogs nor my posts on Instagram. Everything that I do is done willingly, without monetary gain nor profit. It's simply for my love of bodybuilding and for you to learn and become better, and hopefully at learning from my old mistakes and my recent ones too. Goodbye, my friends. God bless you. I'll see you soon. Thank you.